Wanted fugitive pulls a gun on a royal guard. What happens next will shock you. Hidden among smiling tourists and clicking cameras, Evil walked toward Buckingham Palace with deadly purpose. No one noticed the cold calculation in his eyes as he approached the royal guard's post. No one saw the weapon concealed beneath his expensive coat. 20 years of combat experience told guard James Mitchell that something was terribly wrong, but centuries of tradition held him motionless as the fugitive drew his gun. What happened next left the entire crowd in stunned silence. Want to know how the royal guard reacted with precision and discipline? But before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow I've got something really special for you. And now, back to the video. The afternoon shadows stretched long across Buckingham Palace's courtyard as guard James Mitchell maintained his post with unwavering precision. 20 years of military service, including 3 combat tours, had honed his instincts to razor sharpness, instincts that were now quietly screaming of danger. Among the usual crowd of tourists and onlookers, one figure stood out to Mitchell's trained eye. The man moved with calculated casualness, his gait too measured, his observations too precise. While others gazed at the palace's grandeur, this one studied sightlines and patrol patterns with the cold efficiency of someone who had done this before. The stranger's expensive coat seemed at odds with his worn boots, the kind favored by certain paramilitary groups Mitchell had encountered during his service. His clean-shaven face and carefully styled hair spoke of someone trying too hard to blend in. But Mitchell had seen that same disguised hatred in far more dangerous places than this tourist-filled courtyard. The man began drifting closer to Mitchell's position, his path seeming random to untrained observers but following a classic infiltration pattern. Other tourists instinctively created space around him, responding to something in his bearing that set off unconscious alarm bells. A mother pulled her children closer as he passed, her expression uncertain but wary. "Quite the spectacle, isn't it?" The man finally spoke, his accent carefully neutral but carrying undertones of something harder, colder. "All this ceremony, all this," he gestured at the palace walls, "pretense of power." Mitchell maintained his forward gaze, decades of discipline holding firm despite the growing tension in the air. The man's presence radiated a familiar type of danger, not the chaos of common criminals, but the calculated malice of someone with an ideology to prove. An elderly gentleman wearing a veteran's pin paused mid-step, his weathered face registering recognition of the threat unfolding before him. He caught Mitchell's eye for a fraction of a second, one soldier to another, before quietly positioning himself near a young family, ready to assist if needed. The afternoon sun caught Mitchell's campaign medals, each one earned in conflicts where similar ideologies had been met with British steel. The man's eyes flickered to these decorations, his expression hardening with recognition. This was no random tourist. He knew exactly what those medals meant, what kind of soldier stood before him. "Your silence is fitting," the man pressed on, his controlled tone carrying threads of growing agitation. "Like all your kind, hiding behind protocol while the world changes around you." He moved directly into Mitchell's line of sight, close, enough that the guard could detect the faint scent of gun oil beneath his expensive cologne. Mitchell's eyes remained forward, but his combat-trained senses tracked every movement, every subtle shift in the man's stance. The weight distribution in his step suggested military training, not British or American, but something Eastern European. The way he handled himself spoke of more than ideology. This was someone with practical experience. The remaining tourists had begun to sense the wrongness in the air, their excited chatter dying down to worried whispers. Cameras lowered as instinct warned them they were witnessing something beyond the usual tourist spectacle. A group of schoolchildren were quietly shepherded away by their alert teacher, her face tight with concern. "All these medals," the man sneered, moving close enough that his breath fogged the polished brass on Mitchell's uniform. "Earned fighting for what? Democracy? Freedom?" He spat the words like curses. "Pretty words to mask the decay. But we see the truth. We see how your multicultural paradise is crumbling." The elderly veteran had positioned himself near a palace emergency call button, his aged frame belying the alertness in his stance. He'd seen this type before, in newsreels from the 1940s, in the manifestos of modern extremists. The hatred might wear new clothes, but its face remained unchanged. Mitchell's posture remained perfect, his bearing unchanged, but every nerve and muscle was coiled with the readiness that had kept him alive through urban warfare and mountain firefights. As the man began his next circle, Mitchell counted weapons. The visible bulge of a primary firearm, the probability of a backup piece, the slight asymmetry in his jacket that suggested additional equipment. "Did you know?" The man's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, "that we're growing stronger every day? In every city, every country you thought you'd liberated, our message spreads. Your victory in 45 was temporary. The tide is turning." Around them, the palace courtyard had grown unnaturally quiet, as if the very stones were holding their breath. The few remaining tourists stood frozen, sensing they were witnessing not just a confrontation, but a clash of worlds. One built on ceremony and tradition, the other fueled by ancient hatreds in modern dress. Perhaps a history lesson is in order. The man's voice rose now, intentionally playing to the remaining onlookers. About how empires fall, about how your precious tolerance, your democracy, your diversity. He practically snarled the words. "They're all just weakness dressed up as strength." A young couple quickly walked past, the woman's face pale with recognition of the hatred in his words. Her partner placed himself between her and the scene unfolding before them, hurrying her toward the gates. The man tracked their movement with cold eyes, his contempt evident in every line of his face. "Look at them scurrying away," he taunted. "Your citizens so easily frightened, so soft. When the moment comes, and it is coming, they'll fold like paper." He turned back to Mitchell. "But you stand here bound by rules and tradition while I say these things. Does it burn? Does it stir anything in that sanitized, regulated, politically correct mind of yours?" Mitchell's discipline held firm, each word washing over him like rain against stone. He'd faced this ideology before in the mountains of Bosnia, in the streets of war-torn cities. He'd seen its end result, mass graves and broken societies. The man's words weren't just threats. They were echoes of horrors Mitchell had helped stop before. Still nothing? The man's controlled facade began to crack, frustration bleeding into his voice. "Then perhaps it's time for something more memorable. Something to show your precious tourists, your multicultural audience, what real conviction looks like." His hand moved toward his coat, purpose replacing pretense in his movements. The elderly veteran's eyes widened in recognition. He'd seen that particular movement before, decades ago on foreign battlefields. His hand moved toward the emergency call button, but he knew help would arrive too late to prevent what was coming. "You see?" the man continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that seemed to freeze the very air around them. Each word, measured and deliberate like a surgeon selecting his scalpel. Words are important, but actions. His hand emerged from his coat with deliberate slowness, a motion practiced 1,000 times before, each muscle moving with the fluid precision of a predator unsheathing its claws. The expensive fabric parted like stage curtains, revealing the main act. Sunlight caught the blued steel of the weapon, its dark surface drinking in the light like a black hole waiting to devour everything in its path. The metal seemed alive in his hands, its well-worn surface telling silent stories of other moments like this, other targets, other consequences. The few remaining tourists froze in a tableau of horror, their holiday photographs forgotten in the face of real danger. Woman stifled a scream, her manicured nails digging crescents into her companion's arm deep enough to leave marks. The veteran's weathered finger pressed the emergency button, but his eyes that had seen such weapons in darker places, never left the scene unfolding before him. He recognized the distinctive profile immediately. CZ-75, the chosen tool of certain extremist groups who valued its perfect balance of reliability, accuracy, and ease of concealment. Mitchell's eyes remained forward, fixed on that distant point that generations of guards had contemplated before him. But his combat-trained senses catalogued every detail with mechanical precision. The slight wear patterns on the barrel spoke of frequent use, not practice range shooting but real-world application. The custom grip showed the distinctive modifications of a particular weapons shop known to service certain extremist elements. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The man held the pistol with the intimate familiarity of a lover. Its muzzle pointed at the ground for now, like a cobra waiting to strike. CZ-75, modified for special purposes. 15 rounds of purpose, of conviction, of change. His thumb caressed the safety catch before disengaging it with practiced precision, the soft click echoing like thunder in the stunned silence. No cameras caught this moment, no phones recorded the scene. Reality had intruded too harshly on their tourist fantasy. I could end it right here. The man's voice took on an almost dreamy quality, like a poet contemplating a particularly moving verse. One shot to shatter your ceremony, to show everyone how fragile your system really is. He raised the pistol with theatrical slowness, savoring each degree of elevation like a conductor drawing out a crescendo. Each movement was calculated for maximum psychological impact, the gun rising in micro-adjustments designed to prolong the terror. But first I want you to do something for me, he continued, steadying the weapon with surgical precision, aimed center mass at Mitchell's chest where his medals caught the afternoon sun. I want you to admit it's all meaningless. The uniform, the tradition, the discipline, just empty symbols protecting a dying world. Symbols that bleed and die just like everything else. The man's trigger discipline was telling. Finger resting, alongside rather than on the trigger, following advanced weapons training protocols. His stance spoke of Eastern European military doctrine, but modified with more recent terrorist adaptations. Everything about his weapon handling confirmed Mitchell's initial assessment. This was no common street thug with a stolen weapon, but a trained operative with a mission and the skills to carry it out. Time seemed to crystallize, each second stretching into infinity as the man's finger began its journey toward the trigger. In that frozen moment, Mitchell's combat-honed senses registered everything with preternatural clarity. The exact angle of the weapon's muzzle, the man's weight distribution betraying his next intended movement, the minute tells in his stance that telegraphed his intentions like signals in broad daylight. Let this be a lesson to all who still cling to the old world, the man declared, triumph already coloring his tone. Let them see how their traditions fall before real. His words cut off in a sharp intake of breath as Mitchell moved. Not the ceremonial movements tourists came to photograph, but the fluid precision of a combat veteran who had spent decades perfecting his craft. The transition from ceremonial guard to combat operator happened in less than a heartbeat. A shift that spoke of years spent mastering the delicate balance between pageantry and lethality. Before the man's finger could complete its journey to the trigger, before his brain could even register the guard's motion, Mitchell's hand shot out with snake-like speed. In one fluid motion, Mitchell's white-gloved hand clamped around the pistol, his grip honed through thousands of hours of training in rain-soaked ranges and dust-choked combat zones, found the exact pressure points needed. The weapon seemed to simply vanish from the man's grasp, transferred to Mitchell's control with such smooth precision that several onlookers would later swear they hadn't even seen the movement. Just a blur of white glove and suddenly empty hands. Mitchell's fingers moved with the practiced efficiency of a surgeon, each motion deliberate and purposeful. The magazine release depressed under exactly the right pressure, not the fumbling of a range instructor, but the decisive action of someone who had performed this sequence under enemy fire. The magazine dropped free, caught in his left hand before it could hit the ground, the weight telling him instantly that it was indeed fully loaded. His thumb found the slide release with mechanical precision, the movement flowing like water. The chambered round ejected in a graceful arc, the 9mm round spinning through the air before pinging against the courtyard stones with a sound like a small bell tolling. Check chamber clear, safety engaged, mechanism secured. Mitchell's movements flowed with practiced grace, the entire sequence taking less time than most people need to process a sudden sound. The man stood frozen, his empty hand still shaped, around a weapon that was no longer there. Fingers grasping at empty air like a magician's audience after a particularly impressive vanishing act. His face underwent a remarkable transformation from smug superiority to stunned disbelief, then to something approaching fear as the reality of his situation began to dawn. CZ-75B, pre-2010 production. Mitchell spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. Modified trigger assembly, custom grip panels from a Montenegro-based supplier, The serial number's been professionally altered, but the wear pattern on the barrel suggests approximately 2,000 rounds fired, mostly subsonic ammunition based on the carbon fouling pattern. "Give it back," the man snarled, his carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. He stretched out his hand, demanding, "Now." Mitchell's response was as swift as it was decisive. Using the pistol's grip as a pivot point, he brought the weapon's rear sight down in a precise arc. The hardened steel met the bridge of the man's nose with surgical accuracy. Cartilage cracked with a sound like stepping on autumn leaves. Blood erupted from the man's nose, staining his expensive coat. He staggered backward, hands clutching his face, all pretense of sophistication gone. You broke my nose." His voice was thick with pain and rage. "No," Mitchell corrected calmly. "I used appropriate force to neutralize a direct threat to the crown. The broken nose is incidental." His bearing remained parade ground perfect, even as he maintained full control of the situation. Though I should note that attempting to assassinate a royal guard while carrying a modified weapon with illegal ammunition tends to have painful consequences. The man's eyes darted around wildly, searching for escape routes. Blood dripped between his fingers, each drop marking the pavement like a countdown. "You'll regret this," he spat, blood spraying with his words. "We have people everywhere. This isn't over." Mitchell's response carried the weight of someone who had heard similar threats before. "Actually, it was over the moment you revealed your weapon. You see, while you were monologuing about the fall of civilization, you failed to notice several things." His eyes flicked briefly to the elderly veteran. "The silent alarm was triggered 90 seconds ago. Metropolitan police units are already sealing off all exits, and your face has been clearly captured by no fewer than 6 security cameras." The man's complexion paled beneath the blood still flowing from his nose. The sound of approaching sirens began to cut through the afternoon air, growing closer with each passing second. His carefully laid plans were unraveling faster than the blood could drip from his chin. With a hate-filled glare, he turned and ran, shoving past shocked onlookers. In his desperation to escape, his expensive shoes skidded on the stones as he fled, leaving a trail of blood droplets that would make pursuit trivially easy for the approaching authorities. Mitchell remained at his post, his bearing returning to ceremonial precision even as police vehicles screeched to a halt at the palace gates. Armed response units deployed with practiced efficiency, their movements reflecting the countless drills conducted for exactly this type of situation. The elderly veteran approached the responding officers, his military bearing evident as he gave a precise report of events. Other witnesses came forward, their shocked descriptions piecing together a clear picture of what had transpired. Each account emphasized the guard's incredible speed and control, how he had neutralized the threat without ever abandoning his post or losing his composure. "Detective Inspector," Mitchell addressed the senior officer who approached his position, his voice maintaining its professional calm. "The suspect is carrying a modified CZ-75B pistol obtained through illegal channels. Based on his accent variations and tactical training, I'd suggest checking his connections to certain extremist groups operating in Eastern Europe." The detective's eyebrows rose slightly as he took notes. "You got all that from a brief confrontation?" "The weapons modifications are consistent with a specific weapons modifier based in Montenegro. The suspect's stance and weapon handling suggest training from a particular paramilitary camp." Mitchell's analysis continued with methodical precision. His ideology and phraseology match known propaganda from several monitored extremist channels. "I suspect you'll find he's already in your database." As if on cue, another officer rushed up with a tablet. "Sir, facial recognition just got a hit. He's wanted in connection with several incidents across Europe. Interpol's had a flag on him for months." The detective nodded grimly. "Right. We'll have his photo on every news outlet within the hour. He won't get far, not with that broken nose marking him." He glanced at the blood trail leading away from the scene. "Though I have to say that was quite a precise application of force." "The rear sight of a CZ-75B is particularly effective when proper pressure is applied," Mitchell replied, matter-of-factly. "The suspect's nose will require medical attention within the next few hours, making it virtually impossible for him to leave the city undetected." The elderly veteran who had finished giving his statement approached Mitchell with a crisp salute. Royal Marines retired, he introduced himself. That was textbook threat neutralization, son. Reminded me of our close protection training in '82. Mitchell returned the salute with perfect form. Thank you, sir, though I suspect your generation had to handle worse situations than a single-armed ideologue. The veteran smiled slightly. Perhaps, but we didn't have to do it while maintaining ceremonial guard protocol. He glanced at Mitchell's still perfect uniform and posture. I'd say the standards have gone up since my day. As the police began cordoning off the area and taking statements from witnesses, life around Buckingham Palace began returning to normal. Tourists, now held at a safe distance, watched as forensics teams photographed the blood trail and recovered the ejected bullet from the courtyard stones. We'll need a full statement later. The detective made a few final notes before turning back to Mitchell. But for now, is there anything else you can tell us about the suspect? Just one thing, Mitchell replied, his eyes scanning the perimeter with professional thoroughness. Given his ideology and training, he'll likely seek medical attention from underground sources. I'd suggest monitoring certain clinics in the East End, particularly those with recent connections to Balkan expatriate communities. The detective's radio crackled with updates as surveillance cameras tracked the suspect's flight through London's streets. Every police officer in the city now had his description, every hospital was on alert, and a network of law enforcement agencies was closing in like a net around their wounded quarry. The ammunition is check-made subsonic, favored by certain groups for its reliability with suppressors. Mitchell continued his analysis, fingers tracing specific points on the confiscated weapon. The magazine spring has been replaced recently. Serbian manufacturer, if I'm not mistaken. Not standard issue. The firing pin shows distinctive marks from a particular gunsmith known to service specific extremist cells. Other specialists arrived, each confirming Mitchell's assessments with growing respect. Ballistics experts examined the weapon, counter-terrorism. Units analyzed the suspect's rhetoric, and intelligence officers made connections to known extremist networks. Your action today likely prevented something much larger, a counter-terrorism specialist told Mitchell quietly. This particular model with these modifications, it's not typically used for single targets. He was planning something bigger. Through it all, Mitchell maintained his post, his bearing perfect, his attention unwavering. The afternoon sun caught his medals once again, each one a testament to the years of training and experience that had prepared him for moments exactly like this. I've seen that look before, the elderly veteran commented to a young police officer, in men who've faced real combat. The ceremony isn't just for show, it's built on something far more solid. Something today's events just proved. Within hours, the suspect's identity rippled through international law enforcement channels. Surveillance footage from the palace had been cross-referenced with Interpol databases, revealing connections to extremist cells across Eastern Europe. 6 countries want him for questioning, the detective informed Mitchell, reviewing updates on his tablet. The weapon you confiscated matches ballistics from 3 unsolved incidents. Your broken nose just helped us crack cases going back 5 years. Mitchell stood at his post, ceremonial precision unchanged, as intelligence officers quietly confirmed each detail of his initial assessment. The weapon's modifications, the suspect's training, the ideology he'd espoused, every element fitted perfectly into an ongoing international investigation. The guard's analysis was spot on. A counter-terrorism specialist muttered to his colleague. Identified the weapon's origin, the suspect's background, even predicted his likely escape route. Through the East End medical underground, this isn't just military training. This is elite-level threat assessment. News of the incident had been carefully managed. Official statements mentioned only an attempted security breach that was swiftly contained. But in military and law enforcement circles, the story spread rapidly, how a ceremonial guard had transformed centuries of tradition into lightning-fast combat effectiveness. Your response time was exceptional, an SAS officer who'd reviewed the security footage commented. 3-second disarm sequence while maintaining ceremonial posture. That's going into the training manuals. The elderly veteran, before departing, had one final observation. You know what impressed me most? He told Mitchell. Not the disarm, though that was textbook perfect. It was how you returned to ceremonial stance immediately after. That's what the public needs to see, that our Traditions aren't just for show. As evening approached, surveillance teams reported movement in the East End. The suspect's broken nose had indeed forced him to seek medical attention exactly where Mitchell had predicted. Metropolitan Police were already in position, waiting. Sometimes, Mitchell told a young guard who'd arrived to relieve him, "The ceremony is our greatest weapon. They see the uniform, the posture, the tradition. They mistake it for weakness. They forget what lies beneath." The suspect's capture came just before midnight. Metropolitan Police found him exactly where Mitchell had predicted, at a small clinic in the East End with known connections to Balkan expatriates. His broken nose had made disguise impossible, and his need for medical attention had forced him into the open. Found his safe house too, the detective reported back to Palace security. Cache of weapons, detailed surveillance photos of the palace, manifestos. This wasn't just a random attack. He was the advanced scout for something much larger. International security agencies moved swiftly on the intelligence gathered. The suspect's phone, recovered from where he'd dropped it during his flight, provided connections to extremist cells across Europe. Within hours, coordinated raids were taking place in 6 countries. The ceremonial guard spotted what our surveillance teams missed, a senior intelligence officer admitted during the briefing. "We had the suspect on our watch list, but we never anticipated he'd move this boldly. If it wasn't for Guard Mitchell's intervention." Back at the palace, the guard rotation continued as if nothing had happened. Tourists still took photos, still marveled at the precision and discipline. But there was something different now in how the more observant ones watched. A deeper understanding that beneath the ceremony lay real steel. Each guard has at least 10 years of military service, the palace guide had added to her usual speech. The ceremonial duties you see are built on a foundation of combat experience and elite training. Today's incident proved that. Mitchell completed his shift with the same unwavering precision he'd shown for 15 years. But his actions had redefined how people viewed the guard's ceremonial stance. It wasn't just tradition anymore, it was the visible face of a much deeper strength. "You demonstrated something vital today," his commanding officer told him during the official debrief. "You showed that our traditions aren't a weakness to be exploited, but a discipline that makes us stronger." The ceremony isn't just for show, it's the polish on a very real blade. The elderly veteran had left a note with palace security. "To the guard who reminded everyone what we stand for, you did all of us proud. Some think standing still is easy. Today you showed them it's about having the discipline to wait and the skill to act when needed."